Hi, it's Miss Saxon from the Burris Media Center, and I have a really cool book to share with you today. This is the time of year, this is in October, and so we typically like to think about spooky things and maybe stories that have a little bit of a creepy vibe. And I'm trying to look a little bit like Mary Shelley myself. Mary Shelley was the writer of Frankenstein. Now, Frankenstein is a very famous book for a lot of reasons, and one of the most significant things about Frankenstein is it marks one of the first science fiction books. And science fiction is a very broad genre. There's tons of books that have followed. There's TV shows that are in that science fiction genre. And so I wanted just to talk a little bit about that. And I also wanted to give you the story behind the story. So this book is actually a biography about Mary Shelley. And one of the things about Mary Shelley that's interesting is she was surrounded by several famous people in her life. Her husband, Percy Shelley, was a famous poet. She also knew Lord Byron, who was a famous poet. And her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a very famous feminist writer. And she had a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. So I thought that would be kind of interesting to kind of introduce you to that a little bit and tell you the story behind the story. So She Made a Monster, How Mary Shelley Created Frankenstein. 200 years ago, on a wild, stormy night, in a beautiful house on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, a young woman named Mary sat at her dressing table. She and her friends were staying in the house for the season, visiting Lord Byron, the famous English poet. Mary could hear the others still talking downstairs while she brushed her hair by candlelight, thinking of their stories, stories she'd read, stories she heard, stories she wanted to tell. For Mary wanted to become a writer. Her friend Percy Shelley, who would soon be her husband, was a poet. Mary herself came from a family of writers. All around her, she felt the power of words, and she hoped that someday she too would write something important, something that would hit the world like a bolt of lightning splitting the night sky. But for now, she only wanted to write a ghost story. For it all began when the friends had read from a book of frightening tales, entertaining each other through the rainy days and nights. Lord Byron had declared, "We should each write a ghost story. In a week we'll see who has written the best one." The week would be upon them tomorrow. The men had already finished their stories, tales of bloodthirsty vampires and vengeful ghosts. Of course, Byron is the best one with his, Mary thought now. He is an excellent poet after all, but so arrogant. Yet try as she might, Mary had found no way to begin her story. The clock struck midnight. Mary put down her hairbrush and tiptoed in the hall. Over the howling wind, she could hear her friends talking about the latest scientific experiments, their favorite topic. Percy's voice thundered above the stairs. "Electricity," he was saying. "Galvani used it to make a dead frog kick its legs." Mary dashed back to her room. She felt a shiver creep over her. She remembered hearing as a young girl about an even more ghastly experiment. A scientist made a corpse move using electricity. Mary had shuddered as she listened, clinging to her father's legs. She'd only been 6 years old. To erase the terrible image from her mind, Mary opened her locket and looked at the tiny portrait of her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. She died when Mary was a baby. As a girl, Mary learned the alphabet by tracing the letters on her mother's tombstone. When she was older, she'd read everything her mother ever wrote, stirring words about democracy and the rights of women, words that sparked courage and inspiration in many, but anger and outrage in others. Women, the equals of men? What a monstrous thought, people said about her mother's ideas. And for Mary Wollstonecraft to write was even more monstrous. Women were not supposed to have ideas of their own, let alone publish them. Now Mary snapped her locket shut. She wanted to prove that her mother was right. A woman's writing could be just as important as a man's. Downstairs, the men's voices grew louder and more excited. To give life to a lifeless matter would be the ultimate triumph. Man will conquer nature and make her give up the secret. Mary shook her head as she listened. Nature might have very good reasons for keeping her secrets, she thought. Besides, what would happen to that lifeless matter once someone had given it life? The men did not seem to care. They only answered if something could be done, never if it should be done. Thunder rambled in the distance, and the rain beat harder against the window. Mary watched the wax drip down from her candle. Now she could hear the others saying good night and stepping softly on the stairs. She thought of the ghosts and vampires. She thought of the monsters. She thought of the loneliness. The night was passing, and she didn't have a story. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and Mary jumped as her reflection peered back from the pale, strange, so like something dead restored to life. Wouldn't it be terrifying to see such a creature, she mused, or perhaps more terrifying to be such a creature? Mary got into bed and stared up into the darkness. The house by the lake was still. The wind shrieked over the eaves, but Mary was awake to hear it. She let the booming thunder fill her head. She closed her eyes to the burst of lightning, but she did not sleep. Instead, as if in a dream, she saw a huge form lying on the table. It was a man, yet not a man. It had a hideous, scarred face. She saw a young student anxiously bending over the form with a candle. He had achieved his ambition. He discovered nature's secret and given life to the creature on the table. But now he was afraid. He did not know what to do. He dropped the candle, covered his face with his hands, and ran away, hoping the ember of life he had sparked would die out. And suddenly, lying in her bed with the curtains shut, Mary felt as if she was the young creator. She felt as if she ran to the room to cover the sheets, trying not to think of the terrible things she created, trying not to think of it coming to find her. She trembled as she imagined a hand, huge and gray, twisted and appearing through the bedroom curtains. She saw the curtains part. The creature stared at her with bulging yellow eyes. What did it want from her? Mary gasped and sat up in bed. She ripped open the curtains and recognized her own room in the midnight. It was all familiar and ordinary. There was no monster. There was only her imagination. Her heart pounded, but she was happy. She found her story. Mary Shelley, I have a picture of her. This is Mary Shelley, and this is her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley. And this is her famous mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. I did not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves. If you look up Mary Wollstonecraft, there's a lot of great quotes from her, and she's a very interesting person to learn about. It's especially interesting right now. This is the 100th anniversary of women earning the right to vote. And Mary Wollstonecraft was an example and a leader in that, not particularly in the movement to vote, but her ideas inspired a lot of the suffragettes. So she's very interesting to learn about, as is Mary Shelley and her story and the launch of science fiction and tricking nature, finding out the secrets of nature and bringing things to life. Sort of the mad scientist is something that you'll see in a lot of movies and stories. So I hope you enjoyed this book. I hope you enjoyed the pictures. I think that the artwork is very interesting in this book. It has sort of this eerie, sinister feel, perfect for this time of year. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you soon.